It's great to be here. I want to give a shout out to the Davidson fans who are watching and all of you guys, and thank you so much for being here. So this might not come as a surprise to you, given what I do for a living, but I grew up reading. Not in that wicked smart, way ahead of grade level kind of way, more in that she likes books way more than people. Do you think she needs professional help kind of way? I read everything. Cereal boxes, shampoo bottles, the labels on the inside of my gym clothes. I thought this was completely normal until the first day of 8th grade, when our English teacher asked us to write down the books we'd read for pleasure over the summer. So I'm thinking and I'm writing and I'm thinking and I'm writing, and I quickly come up with 37 books. Everything from trashy beach porn to Agatha Christie to Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And I'm thinking and I'm writing and I'm wanting to get to 40 when the kid sitting next to me, who, by the way, had this totally awesome tan, she leans over and she says in that kind of arch tone only popular middle school girls can ever really muster, "Seriously? Don't you have any friends?" She kind of had a point. Books were my closest friends. And to this day, many of the sharpest memories and the most important experiences I've had have come through encounters with books. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about one such encounter, a really vivid memory that I would argue changed my life. So when I was in college in the early 80s at the University of Chicago, my roommate Lee and I, Lee is now a famous economist, by the way, Lee and I, we shared a love of Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple. So for my birthday, Lee gave me a collection of Alice Walker short stories called You Can't Keep a Good Woman Down. The first story I read in this collection is called Advancing Luna and Ida B. Wells. Now, I was in school in the early 80s, and so Lee gave me this book at an important time in the history of the city of Chicago. So the same year that I got this book and started reading it, Harold Washington, who was a US congressman who lived in our neighborhood, he declared his candidacy for mayor of Chicago. Now, if you know anything about Chicago, you know it's a pretty Democratic city. So Harold Washington went on to win the Democratic primary, which should have meant that he was easily a shoo-in for the general election. But here's the thing. Harold Washington was black. As more and more of the white Democratic vote defected in the city of Chicago, University of Chicago students joined with our neighbors to register and turn out record numbers of African Americans. The campaign was contentious and ugly. The chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party, he worked for the Republican. Their slogan, "Vote Epton before it's too late." So think about it. Here I am, a kind of white girl from a small town, comfortably liberal family, grew up reading, went to Quaker school, living for the first time in my life in a big city, a putatively progressive city that was confronting, for the first time, I think, its own deep and enduring racial divide. And I'm reading Advancing Luna, a story by Alice Walker. And I want to talk a little bit about my experience of reading the story in that particular context. So Advancing Luna is a story about two friends, a white woman named Luna, and an African-American woman whose name we never learn. So when I was reading the story, I named her Sol, Luna and Sol, moon and sun. So Sol and Luna meet in 1965 when both travel to Georgia to register African Americans to vote. They're both in college. So this is risky but exhilarating work. Luna and Sol and the other friends with them, they believed they could change the world, and they actually thought it was their obligation to change the world. So they braved heat and flies and hostile state troopers and indifference so that they could make the world a better place, and they believed that what they were doing mattered. So I'm reading this book as a college student in Chicago, and I immediately identify with Luna. I identify with her stringy hair and her acne and her nondescript looks. I identify with her courage. So I'm reading the story totally identified with Luna. So Luna and Sol in the story spend about a month in Georgia registering voters. They both go back to college, and they stay friends. And after they graduate, they decide they're going to share an apartment in New York. It's not until this moment, these women have been friends for years. It's not until this moment, when they're sharing an apartment in New York, that Luna tells Sol that during that time in Georgia, she had been raped by a black man. Luna tells this story, and Sol says, "What did you do?" "Nothing that required making any noise," Luna replies. And then Sol says, "Why didn't you scream? I would have screamed my head off." And Luna says, "You know why." And then Sol thinks to herself, she thinks, "I did. I had seen photographs of Emmett Till's body just after it was dragged from the river. I had seen photographs of white folks standing around roasting something that had talked to them in their own language just before they ripped out its tongue. I knew why, all right." And this conversation first embarrasses Sol, and then it makes her very, very angry. How dare Luna tell me this? How dare she tell me this? She thinks. How dare she tell me this? So when I read this story, remember, I am still completely identified with Luna. To me, she was a hero. I wanted to believe that I would have been a hero too. I wanted to believe that I would not have screamed, that I would have given up my access to justice in order to protect a vulnerable population. That's what I wanted to believe. And this reading of the story made me feel good. If I wanted to be Luna, my anti-racism was confirmed. But there's something about this story, something about it that stuck with me and that left me kind of confused, and I would say a little bit scared. Why was Sol so angry? Why wasn't she grateful to Luna? Why wasn't she proud of her friend? I mean, she knew why Luna didn't scream. She talks about Emmett Till. She knew why Luna didn't scream, and yet these two women who had been so close, somehow they can't be friends anymore. Why was she so angry? Now, something I need to tell you about myself so that you can understand this story. I am terrified of anger. It is the thing that scares me the most. Every instinct in my body tells me to label other people's anger as a sign of craziness or pathology or irrationality. I am afraid of it. So it was super tempting to blame my confusion on Sol. If I could write her anger off, if I could label it and her as crazy, if I could put Sol and her black anger over here in a box, then I could feel all heroic and get all superior about getting out the vote for Harold Washington, my own laudable commitment to social justice confirmed. But I was a reader. And I knew from my teachers at the University of Chicago that to really read, to read honestly and with integrity, you can't ignore the challenges that books present. You can't just pretend like they're not there. You have to confront what it's most tempting to ignore. So I stuck with the question that most made me want to run away. Why was Sol so angry? So out in the world, I watched and I worked for Harold Washington, and in my head, I thought about Sol. And then I saw it, and it's so obvious. I was kind of ashamed and embarrassed that I hadn't seen it before. And my identification in the story shifted from Luna to Sol. I'm sure you've figured it out. Luna can only be a hero because the world around her is so unjust. And the injustice runs deep. And the right to vote alone is not going to fix it. Think about it. Luna's silence can be heroism only in a world where black men, all black men, are routinely subject to arbitrary and brutal violence. The world has to be a totally screwed up place for that to be true. So then, once I figured this out, instead of wanting to be like Luna, instead of defining my heroism in that way, I wanted to help build a world where Luna's silence would make no sense, and no person and no group was routinely subject to arbitrary, extra-legal violence. I learned so much from reading Advancing Luna when I did. First, I learned to face what I most fear, which is anger. And then I learned that deeply entrenched injustice has a kind of eerie, diabolical power. It can turn a call for help into a rallying cry for a lynch mob. That's why Luna stayed quiet. It can turn a friend into a hostile stranger. In North Carolina today, it can turn a teenager's prank gone horribly wrong into a life sentence. Luna, the story took root in me. It took root in me and grew up with me. So that I can honestly say that had I not read it when I did, I would be different. I want to end by talking a little bit about how I would be different. First, and this is kind of good news, I think, for me and maybe for other people, I now have some friends who are actual living, breathing human beings and not just characters in books. So that's good. But more importantly, I think, I learned to go towards what I fear. I'm most afraid of anger, so now I go towards what I fear. So, if I'm walking across the street with my calm and normally unflappable friend, and he slams his hand on the hood of a car that inadvertently creeps into the crosswalk, instead of pretending like that didn't happen, I reach out and take his hand. If my neighbor loses it when her teenage son comes home 10 minutes late, instead of pretending like they're not actually screaming at each other and looking away, I look at her and engage her eyes with mine. When I go towards anger, I learn stuff. So my friend who banged his hand on the car, he has 3 Ivy League degrees. But when he walks home from work at night, white women cross the street to avoid him. And my former neighbor, each time her teenage son leaves the house, she urgently reminds him what to wear, how to speak, where to put his eyes, and where to put his hands if he's stopped by the security force that patrols our neighborhood. These are my friends. Americans like me, parents like me, and every day they ride against a wind that I will never face. Far from being irrational, their anger is a sign that we collectively have a lot of work left to do. Thank you very much.